As the Ford F-150 rumbled toward the security checkpoint of Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, I instinctively slid my hand into my blazer pocket. My fingers grazed the cool, familiar edge of my blue military ID, ready to present it to the sentry. "Put that thing away." My father, sitting in the passenger seat, suddenly lunged across the center console. He snatched the card from my hand and threw it aggressively onto the floorboard. "Don't you dare embarrass Caleb. I told you, today you are just a guest. You are not some failed enlistee showing off a low-level staff badge." My hand hung suspended in the air, empty and trembling. My knuckles turned white as I gripped the steering wheel, forcing the bile of anger back down my throat. I didn't look down at the floor, where my dignity was currently lying under the heel of his dusty work boot. "Mark my words," he hissed, adjusting his collar. "If anyone asks, you're a secretary. Don't let them know the Rileys have a quitter in the family." I swallowed the metallic taste of blood from biting my cheek and nodded. My poor deluded father didn't know that the card he just tossed wasn't a staff badge. It was a Rear Admiral's identification. It was the only card in this truck that had the authority to command the entire fleet, anchored just beyond that fence. I exhaled slowly, a practiced breath I learned in officer candidate school to lower my heart rate, and bent down at the waist. The cab of the truck smelled like stale coffee and the distinct, earthy odor of Ohio mud that seemed to follow my father everywhere. My fingers brushed against the rubber floor mat, searching. There it was. My ID card was wedged pitifully between a crushed, sticky Mountain Dew can and the heavy, mud-caked tread of his Timberland work boots. He didn't even have the courtesy to shift his leg. He just sat there, staring out the window at the Pacific Ocean, occupying as much space as possible. "Hurry up with it," he grumbled, his eyes fixated on the Navy flags snapping violently in the wind outside. "Don't let the guards see you digging in the trash like a raccoon." I hooked the card with my fingernail and pulled it free. I used the sleeve of my blazer to wipe away a smear of gray dirt from the plastic. The face in the photograph looked back at me, stern, focused, the face of a woman who managed billion-dollar budgets and classified operations. But here, in this cab, she was covered in grit. I didn't put the lanyard around my neck. Instead, I shoved the card deep into my trouser pocket, burying it next to my lint and loose change. It felt like I was personally conducting a funeral for my own identity. We rolled past the sentry. I handed over my civilian driver's license with a forced, tight-lipped smile. The young sailor waved us through, oblivious to the fact that a flag officer was driving the vehicle. As the base opened up before us, revealing the pristine, manicured lawns and the looming gray hulls of warships in the distance, Dad cleared his throat. I knew that sound. It was the preamble to a sermon. "You know, Teddy Roosevelt had it right," he announced, his voice booming in the confined space. He loved the sound of his own voice almost as much as he loved the idea of war. He said the credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, the man whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood. He turned his body, slapping the empty leather seat behind him where my brother, Caleb, would usually be sitting. "That is your brother, Amelia. That boy is a warrior. He strives valiantly." Dad paused for effect, then looked at me in the rearview mirror. His blue eyes, usually so warm when looking at Caleb, were sharp as a razor when they found mine. "And you are the critic. You're the cold, timid soul who knows neither victory nor defeat. You sit in the stands, clean and safe, pointing out how the strong man stumbles." Every word was a nail driven into my chest. I kept my eyes on the road, watching the yellow lines blur. The arena, I thought bitterly. He had no idea. My arena didn't have cheering crowds. My arena was a windowless room in the Pentagon called a SCIF, where the air was recycled and the decisions I made determined whether thousands of men like Caleb lived to see another sunrise. But to Frank Riley, if you didn't have mud on your boots, you weren't working. "Frank, please, don't start on her." My mother's voice floated from the back seat. It was frail, barely audible over the hum of the engine. I glanced in the mirror. Mom was making herself as small as possible, gazing out the window at the passing barracks. That was her contribution to my defense for the last 40 years. A polite request for a ceasefire that she knew would be ignored. Dad let out a short, dismissive laugh. You coddled her, Mary. That's the problem. And look at the result. What has she done for the Riley name? 42 years old. No husband, no kids. Just some vague paper-pushing job in D.C. filing memos. Mom went silent. I saw her hand dip into her purse and pull out her rosary beads. Her thumb moved rhythmically over the plastic crucifix. Hail Mary, full of grace. Her silence was worse than his insults. His words were just noise, but her silence was a confirmation. It told me that in this war, I was entirely, utterly alone. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, reciting a different verse in my head. Matthew 6:4, Your Father who sees in secret will reward you. It was the only shield I had left. We pulled into the visitor parking lot near the parade deck. The asphalt was radiating heat. Before the engine even fully cut out, Dad had popped his door open, energized by the proximity to military greatness. And there he was. Caleb. My little brother stood near the entrance, looking like a recruiting poster in his dress whites. The uniform was crisp, the fabric blindingly bright in the California sun. Dad! Caleb yelled, waving. My father moved with a speed I hadn't seen in years. He practically leaped from the truck, bypassing me completely to wrap Caleb in a bone-crushing bear hug. There he is! There's my seal! I stepped out of the truck, the heat hitting me instantly. I walked around to the trunk to get our things, but Dad was already there. He grabbed the cooler full of water bottles and the heavy professional camera bag he had brought. He didn't hand them to me. He threw them at me. I caught the camera bag against my chest with a grunt, the strap tangling around my arm. The cooler slammed against my hip. Hold these, Amelia, he ordered, not even looking at me. His eyes were locked on Caleb, glowing with adoration. Your brother's hands are for holding a rifle and accepting medals, not for hauling water. At least make yourself useful for once. I stood there, weighed down by 50 pounds of gear, looking like a hired porter. Dad put his arm around Caleb's shoulders, and Mom fell in step beside them. They began walking toward the parade field, a perfect triad. So, tell me about Hell Week again, I heard Dad say as they drifted away. I adjusted the heavy strap cutting into my shoulder, the dust from the floorboard still on my fingers. I took a deep breath, swallowed the lump in my throat, and began to follow them, keeping a respectful 10 paces behind. Just a guest. Just a spectator. Just a ghost. The bronze statue of the naked warrior stood imposing on its concrete pedestal, a silent sentry overlooking the Pacific Ocean. It was the holy grail for every family visiting the Naval Amphibious Base. The statue, a tribute to the World War II frogmen, who were the forefathers of the modern SEALs, was the obligatory backdrop for graduation photos. The air here was salty and thick with the sound of seagulls and distant boat engines. My father, re-energized by the atmosphere, dropped the cooler he had been carrying and grabbed Caleb by the shoulder, steering him toward the monument. Get in there, Mary. You too, son, Dad barked, his face flushed with excitement. Right in front of the plaque, we need the ocean in the background. They shuffled into position. Mom smoothed her skirt, looking uncomfortable in the wind, while Caleb stood tall, his white uniform gleaming against the dark bronze of the statue. I set the heavy gear bags down on the pavement and instinctively took a step forward. It was a reflex. I was a Riley. I was part of this family. I moved to stand next to Mom, just as I had in every family portrait since I was a toddler. But before the heel of my shoe could even touch the bottom step of the pedestal, a heavy hand slammed against my chest. It wasn't a strike, exactly. It was a stiff arm, the kind a football player uses to keep a defender at bay. The force of it stopped me dead in my tracks and pushed me back 2 stumbling steps. Not you, Amelia, Dad said. His voice was devoid of malice. It was just cold, factual, as if he were correcting a child who didn't know their place. This picture is for the people who served, the people who sacrificed. He pointed a calloused finger at the heavy Canon camera bag I had just set down. You take the picture. That's why you're here. I stood there for a second, the breath knocked out of me not by his hand, but by his logic. In his mind, my 20-year career, my rank, my sacrifices, they didn't exist. I was a civilian, an outsider. I swallowed the lump in my throat, picked up the camera, and uncapped the lens. It was a heavy, professional-grade DSLR that Dad had bought specifically for this trip. I lifted it to my face, grateful for the black plastic body that hid my expression. I twisted the focus ring. The image in the viewfinder blurred, then snapped into razor-sharp clarity. It was a perfect American family. The proud, blue-collar father, the devoted, silent mother, the hero son. Framed perfectly against the blue sky and the bronze warrior. It was a complete picture. It didn't need me. "Smile!" Dad shouted, puffing out his chest. "Look like a warrior, Caleb." I pressed the shutter button. Click. I took another. And another. Capturing the happiness I was explicitly excluded from. My eye began to water, blurring the viewfinder again, but I didn't dare lower the camera to wipe it away. I couldn't let him see me cry. I wasn't his daughter right now. I was the hired help. I was the logistics officer for the Frank Riley Glory Tour. "Frank, is that Frank Riley?" A booming voice came from the sidewalk behind me. I lowered the camera and turned. A large man in a plaid shirt and khakis was waddling toward us, flanked by a woman with dyed blonde hair. "Bob Miller!" Dad shouted, breaking his pose. He rushed over to shake the man's hand. "I didn't know you guys were coming out." It was Mr. Miller, our old neighbor from Ohio. Small world. They started the loud backslapping ritual of two Midwestern dads meeting far from home. Dad immediately pulled Caleb over, showing him off like a prize steer at the county fair. "You remember Caleb. Just graduated. Top of his class, probably." Dad bragged, ignoring the fact that Caleb had barely scraped by academically. Mr. Miller nodded appreciatively, then his eyes drifted over to me. He squinted against the sun. "And is that Amelia?" "Well, I'll be damned. Haven't seen you since you left for... Where was it? College?" He smiled warmly. "I heard you were doing big things in D.C., working for the government, right?" I opened my mouth to speak, to offer a polite, vague answer about the Pentagon, but Dad cut in. He stepped between us, his smile tight and dismissive. "Big things? Hardly." Dad laughed, waving his hand as if swatting away a fly. "She's a secretary, Bob. Works in a basement office somewhere filing papers and making coffee for the brass. You know how it is. Safe work? Boring work." Mr. Miller's smile faltered. He looked at me, and the respect in his eyes instantly dissolved into pity. "Oh, I see. Well, that's good too. Benefits are probably good, right? Good for a single woman." "Exactly," Dad said. "Keeps her busy." I gripped the camera strap so hard the nylon bit into my skin. Secretary. I commanded a budget larger than the GDP of some small countries, and he had reduced me to a coffee girl. I forced a smile, a mask of stoic indifference, and nodded. "It pays the bills, Mr. Miller." We said our goodbyes and started walking toward the reception hall. Dad was walking on air, still high from bragging to his neighbor. I lagged behind, hauling the camera and the cooler again. We passed a row of administrative buildings. A group of 3 naval officers was walking toward us in their khakis. They were young, fit, and moving with purpose. The one in the lead, a lieutenant with the shiny silver bars on his collar, looked up as we approached. His eyes scanned our group. He saw Dad, saw Caleb, and then his gaze landed on me. He stopped. His eyes went wide. He recognized me. I had briefed his unit 2 months ago regarding a classified deployment schedule. He knew exactly who the woman in the gray blazer carrying a cooler was. His posture stiffened. His right hand started to twitch upward, instinctively moving to snap a salute to a flag officer. "Good morning, he started to say. My eyes locked onto his. I didn't slow down. I simply narrowed my eyes and gave a microscopic shake of my head. "Don't you dare!" my eyes screamed. "Not now." The lieutenant froze. He was smart. He saw the civilian clothes, the heavy bags, the oblivious family. He understood the order. He swallowed the word, Admiral, dropped his hand, and awkwardly looked at the ground, sidestepping us as he hurried past. Dad, who had been watching the interaction, let out a snort of derision. "Did you see that, Amelia?" he sneered, shaking his head. That officer didn't even look you in the eye. He almost bumped into you. He gestured around the base, encompassing the ships, the flags, and the sailors. You don't belong here, he said, satisfied with his own assessment. To these men, you're invisible. And honestly, it's better that way. Just stay in the background and don't embarrass your brother. I watched the lieutenant disappear around the corner, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Dad was wrong. I wasn't invisible. I was incognito. And the weight of that secret was becoming heavier than the bags I was carrying. The outdoor reception area was thick with the smell of charcoal smoke, sweet BBQ sauce, and the salty tang of the Pacific breeze. It was a classic American celebration, loud, boisterous, and fueled by coolers full of ice-cold beer. My father was in his element. He had already downed his third can of Budweiser and had successfully commandeered a large picnic table in the center of the patio. He was holding court, surrounded by a group of other parents who were listening to him with polite, slightly glazed-over expressions. It's genetics, pure and simple, Dad announced, waving a sauce-covered pork rib in the air like a conductor's baton. A drop of red sauce splattered onto the white plastic tablecloth, but he didn't notice. My father fought in the Pacific in World War II. I did my time in Vietnam, and now Caleb is a SEAL. The warrior blood runs straight through the Riley veins. One of the other fathers, a man wearing a Navy Dad baseball cap, gestured toward me with his plastic fork. What about the girl? Did she enlist? Dad stopped mid-chew. He waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away a persistent fly. Genetic glitch, he laughed, looking around for approval. She takes after her mother's side, soft, scared of loud noises. She actually tried military school years ago, but she quit after 2 weeks because she missed her pillow. I sat at the far edge of the bench, staring intently at my empty plastic plate. I didn't say a word. I didn't correct him. I didn't mention that I had graduated valedictorian from the Naval Academy, or that the military school he was referring to was a 2-week summer camp I attended when I was 12. Caleb returned to the table then, balancing a large tray of food. He set a plate in front of Dad. A massive slab of ribs, glistening with glaze, and a heap of coleslaw. He gave Mom a sensible plate of grilled chicken salad. Then, he looked at the last 2 plates. One had a nice cut of brisket, the other held a hamburger that had clearly been left on the grill too long. Half of it was charred black, and a scoop of cold, limp fries. Caleb hesitated, his hand hovering over the brisket. He looked at me, then at the meat. Dad reached out and snatched the plate with the burnt burger. He slid it across the table toward me. It stopped with a dull thud. Eat up, he said, his voice loud and artificially generous. The ribs and brisket ran out. Besides, you sit in an air-conditioned office all day, Amelia. You don't want to get fat. Leave the protein for Caleb. He needs the muscle to defend this country. You just need enough strength to type on a keyboard. I looked at the charred puck of meat. I picked it up, feeling the dry, hard crust against my fingertips. I took a bite. It tasted like ash and lighter fluid. It tasted exactly like my life at that moment, bitter and hard to swallow. Excuse me, I mumbled, standing up abruptly. I need to use the ladies' room. I walked away fast, keeping my head down, navigating through the maze of tables and laughing families. I pushed into the restroom, grateful for the sudden silence and the smell of industrial lemon cleaner. I turned on the faucet and splashed cold water on my face, trying to wash away the heat of humiliation. I was reaching for a paper towel when the door swung open. A woman walked in. She was elegant, wearing a navy dress that cost more than my father's truck. It was Eleanor Harris, the wife of Admiral Harris, the commander of the Pacific Fleet. We had had dinner together just last week in D.C. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes went wide. Amelia, she gasped. My God, is that you? She started to rush toward me, her arms opening for a hug. Richard told me you were the architect behind the new deployment strategy, but I didn't know you were I panicked. I pressed my index finger sharply to my lips. Shh. Eleanor, please. She froze, confused. She looked at my plain civilian clothes, the gray blazer, the lack of ribbons or rank. Then she looked toward the door, where the sound of my father's loud, bragging voice was faintly audible. She was a smart woman. Being a military spouse for 30 years had taught her how to read a room. The confusion in her eyes melted away, replaced by a look of profound, heartbreaking pity. "They don't know, do they?" she whispered. I shook my head, feeling my throat tighten. Eleanor stepped forward and took my wet hands in hers. She squeezed them hard. "You are the strongest woman I know, Admiral. I don't know how you do it." "Please," I whispered back, "don't blow my cover." She nodded solemnly, promising silence with her eyes. I waited a moment, composed myself, and walked back out into the heat. When I got back to the table, Caleb was being pressured into chugging a beer by Dad. My brother looked flushed, his eyes swimming slightly. He looked up at me, and for the first time today, I saw guilt on his face. "Dad," Caleb slurred slightly. "You know, Amelia, actually. She works really hard, too." I held my breath. Was he going to say it? Dad slammed his empty can onto the table, crushing it. He laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Hard? Please," Dad scoffed. "What's hard? A paper jam in the Xerox machine? Running out of blue pens?" He leaned in, pointing a finger at Caleb. "Don't you defend her mediocrity, son. The truth hurts, but it's necessary. This world runs on men with guns, like you, not on the people who file the paperwork afterward." Caleb's mouth snapped shut. He looked down at his boots, choosing the safety of silence over the danger of the truth, just like Mom. I sat back down and picked up my cup of lukewarm water. I took a long sip to wash down the taste of the burnt burger. If you are listening to this and you know exactly how that bitter burger tasted, if you have ever had to swallow your pride just to keep the peace in your own family, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button and comment, "I am still standing," below. Let's show Frank Riley he's wrong. I set the cup down. 2 hours, I told myself. Just 2 more hours, and I can disappear. The boisterous noise of the reception, the clinking of beer cans, and the drone of my father's bragging voice finally became too much. The air under the patio cover felt thick, suffocating, composed entirely of charcoal smoke and lies. I slipped away while Caleb was distracted by a group of his new platoon mates. I didn't head for the parking lot. Instead, I walked toward the back of the venue, finding a narrow paved path that led down to the water. The further I walked, the quieter it got. The laughter faded, replaced by the rhythmic, heavy sound of the Pacific Ocean slapping against the concrete pilings. I found a spot on an old, deserted pier, far away from the celebration of the heroes. The wind out here was biting, whipping my hair across my face, but it felt clean. I leaned my elbows against the rusted iron railing and looked out at the bay. In the distance, the gray silhouettes of 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers bobbed gently in the harbor. Further out, the looming shadow of an aircraft carrier cut the horizon. I stared at them, feeling a strange, aching familiarity. That was my real family. Those millions of tons of steel, those radar systems, those thousands of sailors sleeping in narrow racks, they listened to me. When I spoke, they moved. When I signed a paper, they deployed. Yet 50 yards behind me, my own flesh and blood wouldn't even let me finish a sentence about my job. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, worn object. It was a rosary, the beads made of simple wood, smoothed down by decades of prayer. It had been my grandmother's. She was the only Riley who had ever looked at me with something other than disappointment. "Amelia," she used to say, holding my chin, "you have the eyes of a general. Don't let them make you look down." I rubbed the wooden cross with my thumb. The texture brought back a memory I had tried very hard to bury. It was 3 years ago, the day I pinned on my first star. Making Rear Admiral is a statistical anomaly. It is the summit of a career, the moment you ascend from being an officer to being a flag officer. I had sent first-class tickets to Ohio a month in advance. I wanted them there. I wanted Dad to see that I had made it to the top of the mountain, even if I climbed a different path than he wanted. He sent the tickets back. I could still hear his voice on the phone, casual and dismissive. "Can't make it, Amy. I've got to reshingle the tool shed before the rains come. Besides, it's just a ceremony for paper pushers, right? Not like you're receiving the Medal of Honor. That night, after the ceremony, after the handshakes from the Secretary of the Navy and the polite applause of strangers, I didn't go to the gala dinner. I felt like a fraud in the ballroom. Instead, still wearing my dress whites, the immaculate choker collar, the gold shoulder boards, the single star gleaming under the streetlights. I drove my car through an In-N-Out drive-thru. I bought a double-double, animal style, and a chocolate shake. I parked in the darkest corner of the lot, engine idling. I sat there, a newly minted Admiral, eating a fast food burger alone in the dark. I remembered a drop of special sauce falling onto my pristine white trousers, leaving a stain I couldn't wipe off. I stared at that stain and broke down. I cried until I couldn't breathe, sobbing into the wax paper wrapper. That night, amidst the smell of grilled onions and loneliness, I learned the hardest lesson of command. Success unshared is colder than failure. A victory with no one to toast it feels remarkably like a defeat. The wind on the pier gusted, snapping me back to the present. The salt spray stung my eyes, or maybe they were stinging for other reasons. I closed my hand tight around the rosary, the wood digging into my palm. I bowed my head. "Lord," I whispered into the crashing waves, my voice cracking. "Take this cup from me." I wasn't Jesus in the garden, but I felt the weight of my own impending crucifixion. I knew what was coming in that hall. More insults, more erasure. "But," I continued, the prayer turning into a bargain, "if I must drink it so this family can have their happy day, then give me the strength to stay quiet. Give me the humility to play the fool for just a few more hours. Don't let me scream at him. Don't let me destroy him just to save my own pride." I didn't pray for glory. I didn't pray for them to recognize me. I just prayed for the endurance to survive their ignorance. Then, the sky tore open. Boom roar. The sound was physical, a vibration that started in the soles of my feet and rattled my teeth. Two FA-18 Super Hornets screamed overhead, banking hard over the bay in a low-altitude training maneuver. They were moving at 400 knots, trailing white vapor from their wingtips, their afterburners glowing like angry eyes. The noise was deafening. To anyone else, it was just noise. But to me, it was a language. It was the sound of freedom. It was the sound of billions of dollars of American air power. And it was the sound of my world. I opened my eyes and watched them bank upward, disappearing into the clouds. My heart, which had been beating with the erratic rhythm of anxiety, suddenly steadied. It synced with the fading roar of the jets. I am not a secretary, the rhythm beat. I am not a disappointment. I am Rear Admiral Amelia Riley. I command the chaotic sea. I can certainly handle one insecure old man. I put the rosary back in my pocket. I smoothed down the front of my gray blazer, brushing off imaginary lint. I squared my shoulders, adjusting my posture until my spine was a rod of steel. The sad, lonely woman who ate burgers in the dark was gone. She stayed on the pier. The woman who turned back toward the reception hall was different. I checked my watch. The graduation ceremony, the main event, was starting in 20 minutes. "All right, Dad," I whispered to the empty air. "Let's finish this." I turned on my heel and marched back toward the noise, my head high, walking with the stride of someone who owns the ground beneath her feet. The auditorium was a cavernous space, chilled by aggressive air conditioning and smelling faintly of floor wax and nervous sweat. It was packed to capacity. Every seat was filled with proud parents, wives, and girlfriends, a sea of Sunday bests and patriotic lapel pins. The front 3 rows were cordoned off with velvet ropes. These were the VIP seats, upholstered in plush red fabric, reserved for the families of the graduating class and high-ranking guests. My father, energized by the grandeur of the event, practically marched Mom down the center aisle. He spotted our assigned section in the second row, right near the stage. He ushered Mom in first, then Caleb's empty seat was saved, and then he took the aisle seat for himself, spreading his legs wide in a display of territorial dominance. I followed close behind, carrying the heavy camera bag and the cooler, my shoulders aching. I moved to slide into the empty seat next to Mom, grateful for a chance to finally sit down. Thump. Dad swung the heavy canvas camera bag off his shoulder and dropped it squarely onto the seat I was aiming for. He then draped his navy blue blazer over the back of it. "Full up," he said, not even turning his head to look at me. His eyes were scanning the program. I blinked, confused. "Dad, that's a seat. The bag can go on the floor." "The floor is dirty," he snapped, finally glancing at me with irritation. "That's expensive equipment. Besides, you need to be mobile. You can't get good angles from here." He gestured vaguely toward the back of the auditorium with his thumb. "Go find a spot in the back, or stand against the wall. You're just here to take pictures when Caleb walks across the stage anyway. Don't crowd the family section." I looked at Mom. She was studying her hands, twisting her wedding ring. I looked around. People were watching. I felt the heat rising in my neck. I didn't argue. I couldn't make a scene here, not in this house of honor. I tightened my grip on my purse, turned around, and began the long, lonely walk back up the aisle. I passed row after row of smiling families, feeling like an intruder. I found a spot at the very back of the room, near the double doors. I leaned against the cold plaster wall, standing next to a teenage usher and two Secret Service agents who were scanning the crowd. This was where the help stood. "Ladies and gentlemen, please rise for the national anthem." The voice boomed over the PA system. The rustle of fabric filled the room as 2,000 people stood up in unison. "Oh, say, can you see?" The familiar notes of the Star-Spangled Banner swelled from the orchestra pit. My spine snapped straight instinctively. My heels clicked together. My right hand twitched, starting its upward arc toward my brow for a salute. It was muscle memory, burned into me over 20 years of service. I caught myself just in time. I forced my hand down to my side, clenching it into a fist to stop the reflex. I was in civilian clothes. I was incognito. I wasn't an officer today. I was Frank Riley's disappointment. Down in the second row, I saw Dad. He was standing taller than anyone else. His chest was puffed out so far it looked painful. He was singing, his baritone voice booming louder than the people around him, making sure everyone knew how patriotic he was. He looked the part of the perfect American father. As the anthem faded, the room remained standing. A petty officer took the stage. "The SEAL ethos," he announced. 200 young men in dress whites shouted in unison. Their voices shook the walls. "In times of war or uncertainty, there is a special breed of warrior ready to answer our nation's call. I will never quit. My nation expects me to be physically harder and mentally stronger than my enemies." Dad turned his head. He looked all the way to the back of the room, searching for me. When he found me standing against the wall, he locked eyes with me. He didn't smile. He just nodded slowly, as if to say, "Do you hear that? That is what you are not." We sat down. The base commander, a captain with a chest full of ribbons, took the podium. He began a speech about the silent professionals, the men who work in the shadows, the sacrifice that goes unnoticed. I watched Dad lean over to the man sitting next to him, a stranger. Dad pointed to the stage, then gestured back toward me. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read his lips perfectly. "That's my boy up there. My girl. No, she likes the easy life, paperwork." The stranger chuckled and looked back at me with a sympathetic shake of his head. I felt like I was being suffocated. The air in the room felt thin. He was slandering me in my own church, desecrating my service in the very hall where I had sworn my oaths. I wanted to leave. I wanted to push through those double doors and drive until the ocean ran out. But I stayed. I stayed because I was a Riley, and we didn't run. I stayed because I was a stoic, and I could endure this. And now, the announcer's voice cut through my internal spiral. "It is my distinct honor to introduce the commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, Lieutenant General Michael Vance." The room went deathly silent. This was the main event. General Vance walked onto the stage. He was a legend, a 3-star general who had seen combat in 3 different decades. He moved with the predatory grace of an old eagle. He didn't approach the podium immediately. Instead, he walked to the edge of the stage. He didn't look at his prepared remarks. He looked at the audience. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, began to scan the crowd. He was looking for something, or someone. He looked at the VIP section. He looked right past my father, who was practically vibrating with excitement. He looked past the captains and the majors. His gaze swept up, over the heads of the crowd, all the way to the back of the room. And then, he stopped. Across 100 feet of crowded auditorium, the general's eyes locked onto mine. He froze. His brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his stoic face. He squinted, confirming what he was seeing. Then the surprise evaporated, replaced by a look of intense, profound recognition. My breath hitched in my throat. The air conditioner hummed, but for me, the world had gone silent. He saw me. He really saw me. And I knew, with terrifying certainty, that the silence was about to be broken. General Vance did not look down at the prepared speech on the podium. He stood there for a long, uncomfortable moment, his hands gripping the edges of the lectern until his knuckles showed white. He leaned forward, and a sharp, high-pitched screech of feedback from the microphone sliced through the silence, making half the room flinch. The general didn't apologize for the noise. He just stared out at the sea of faces, his expression unreadable. Before we proceed with commissioning these new warriors, Vance's voice rumbled through the speakers, deep and gravelly. I've noticed a significant breach of protocol. In the second row, my father perked up. He craned his neck, looking around excitedly. He leaned over to Mom, whispering loud enough for me to hear from the back of the room. Protocol, Dad muttered, nodding sagely. Bet a senator just walked in, or maybe the Secretary of Defense. Watch, Mary, someone big is coming. He smoothed his tie, readying himself to be in the proximity of power. He had no idea the power was already in the room, standing 40 feet behind him against a cold plaster wall. This unit is trained to identify threats and assets in high-stress environments, General Vance continued, his eyes still scanning the back of the room. But today, it seems we have failed to recognize our own chain of command. The room went deadly quiet. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning vents. Then, General Vance raised his right arm. He pointed a single, steady finger directly over the heads of the VIPs, over the heads of the officers, straight at the back corner near the exit doors. Straight at me. I am honored to recognize the presence of the architect behind our current Pacific defense strategy, a woman who taught me everything I know about naval intelligence operations, Vance said, his voice swelling with authority. Welcome ashore, Rear Admiral Amelia Riley. The name hit the room like a physical blow. For a split second, there was absolute silence. The kind of silence that follows a gunshot before the echo registers. My father froze. His body went rigid, as if his spine had fused into a solid bar of iron. He didn't turn around immediately. He couldn't. His brain was trying to process a reality that contradicted his entire existence. Slowly, painfully, like a rusted turret traversing on a tank, Frank Riley turned in his seat. He looked past the velvet ropes. He looked past the rows of strangers. He looked all the way back to the shadow against the wall. His mouth fell open. His eyes were wide, round discs of pure, unadulterated shock. He looked like he was seeing a ghost. But the general wasn't done. Captain, Vance barked at the commanding officer on stage. The captain snapped to attention. He took a breath that expanded his chest, and then, with a voice that could shatter glass, he bellowed the most powerful command in the Navy. Attention on deck. Kaboom! It wasn't a sound. It was an earthquake. In a single, synchronized motion, 200 graduating SEALs on the stage and dozens of high-ranking officers in the audience surged to their feet. 400 heels slammed into the wooden floorboards at the exact same millisecond. The sound reverberated through my ribcage, a thunderclap of discipline and respect. The entire auditorium became a sea of white and khaki uniforms, turning as one. They weren't facing the stage anymore. They were facing me. 250 hands snapped up. The air whistled as they cut through it. It wasn't a casual wave. It wasn't the half-hearted gesture of a neighbor. It was a rigid, razor-sharp salute. Every spine was straight, every chin was tucked, every eye was locked onto the secretary in the gray blazer. I peeled myself away from the wall. I didn't need the shadows anymore. I stepped into the aisle, standing in the pool of light. I squared my shoulders, lifting my chin. I looked through my glasses, scanning the faces of the men who were currently offering me their unconditional obedience. I saw Caleb up on the stage. His face was drained of blood, pale as his uniform. He was saluting, his hand trembling slightly against his brow, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. And then I looked down at the second row. Frank Riley was the only man sitting down. He looked small. He looked withered. His hand, which had been holding his iPhone to record Caleb, went limp. Clatter. The phone hit the floorboards, sliding under the seat in front of him. He didn't reach for it. He couldn't move. He was staring at me, and then looking back at the 3 silver stars on General Vance's shoulder, and then back at me. The math finally worked in his head. The paperwork, the office job, the secretary. The lie he had told himself, the lie that I was a failure so he could feel like a success, shattered into a million jagged pieces. His face turned a deep, violacious red. It started at his collar and flooded up to his hairline. It wasn't anger. It was shame. A thick, suffocating shame that seemed to shrink him physically. He slumped in his chair, pulling his arms in, trying to make himself disappear between the standing giants who were saluting his daughter. For 40 years, Frank Riley had been the loudest man in every room. But in this hall of heroes, under the weight of the truth, he was finally, blissfully silent. If you felt a shiver down your spine when those heels hit the floor, and if you believe that the truth always comes out in the end, do me a favor. Hit that like button right now and comment, "Respect," below. Let's show Frank Riley that we see exactly who the real hero is. I held the gaze of the room for one heartbeat longer. Then, slowly, deliberately, I raised my right hand. I didn't smile. I simply returned the salute. I held the salute for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to acknowledge the respect, short enough to remind them that there was still work to be done. "Thank you, gentlemen," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the pin-drop silence of the auditorium, it carried all the way to the stage. "Carry on." I dropped my hand. Simultaneously, 200 hands snapped down. The sound of fabric brushing against fabric was the only noise in the room. General Vance nodded at the stage, signaling the ceremony to continue, and the room exhaled. People sank back into their seats, the folding chairs squeaking under the collective weight of a stunned audience. But the atmosphere had irrevocably shifted. The air in the room, previously thick with anticipation for the new graduates, was now heavy with a different kind of tension. Nobody was looking at the stage anymore. Nobody cared about the diplomas being handed out. Every eye in the room was darting furtively toward the back wall where I stood, and then bouncing down to the second row of the VIP section. The whispering started slowly, a low hum that quickly grew into the buzzing of an agitated hive. In a small town or a tight-knit military community, gossip travels faster than light. "Did you see that? That's Frank Riley's daughter. I thought he said she was a secretary." "A rear admiral? Does he not know his own kid's rank?" "God, that's embarrassing. He's been bragging about the son all morning and ignoring a flag officer." Down in row 2, my father sat hunched over. The man who had taken up so much space in the truck, who had spread his legs wide and draped his coat over my seat, had collapsed in on himself. He was staring at his knees, his hands gripping his thighs so hard his knuckles were white. He looked like he was trying to physically shrink, to fold himself into the gaps between the floorboards. Mr. Miller, our neighbor from Ohio, leaned in from the aisle seat. He didn't whisper quietly enough. "Frank," Miller hissed, confused but accusing. "You told me she made coffee. You said she was administrative support." Dad didn't answer. He couldn't. He just shook his head slightly, a jerky, spasm-like motion. He didn't look left. He didn't look right. He certainly didn't look back at me. The arrogance that had fueled him for decades had been stripped away, leaving behind a confused, shivering old man. Beside him, my mother did something she had never done in my lifetime. She stopped praying. She wrapped her rosary beads around her wrist, placed her hands in her lap, and turned her head to look at her husband. She didn't scream. She didn't scold. She just looked at him with a quiet, devastating disappointment. That look was louder than any shout. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur. When the final dismissal was given, the room erupted into movement. Usually, this is when families rush the stage. Not today. General Vance stepped off the podium and walked straight down the center aisle. People who had been waiting to shake his hand saw his trajectory and instinctively stepped back. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, clearing a wide path from the stage directly to the back wall. Vance ignored the local politicians. He ignored the other officers. He walked straight up to me, his hand extended. "Amelia," he said warmly, grasping my hand in a firm shake. "I didn't know you were on the guest list. If I had known, I would have had a chair for you next to me on stage. We could have used your input on the keynote." "I'm just here as family today, General," I replied, keeping my voice level. "Off the clock." "Family?" Vance raised an eyebrow. He turned his head, looking down the empty aisle toward the second row, where my father was struggling to stand up, looking like a man walking on a ship in a hurricane. "Well," Vance said, his voice carrying clearly to the VIP section. "They must be incredibly proud. It's not every family that produces a strategist of your caliber. The Navy is lucky to have you, Admiral." The words hit my father like physical blows. Proud, strategist, Admiral. Frank Riley stood up, swaying slightly. He grabbed his coat, clutching it to his chest like a shield. He didn't look at the general. He looked like he wanted to run, to flee the scene of his public execution. "Excuse me, sir," I said to Vance. "I should go see my brother." Vance nodded respectfully and stepped aside. I didn't have to go far. Caleb was already running toward me. He had jumped off the stage, bypassing the stairs. He still held his diploma in one hand and his trident pin in the other. He ran right past Mom. He ran right past Dad, who had half raised a hand as if expecting a high five. Caleb didn't even slow down for him. My brother skidded to a halt in front of me, his chest heaving, sweat dripping down his forehead. He looked at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Amelia," he stammered. He looked at my civilian clothes, then at my face, struggling to reconcile the sister he bullied with the officer his commander had just saluted. "Rear Admiral, I didn't." He started to raise his hand to salute, a reflex of his new training. I reached out and knocked his hand down gently. I stepped forward and pulled him into a hug. It wasn't a formal embrace. It was a sister holding her baby brother. I felt him shaking against me. "Congratulations, Caleb," I whispered into his ear. "You made it. Good job." He pulled back, tears welling in his eyes. He looked over my shoulder at the crowd, then back at me. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I should have said something at the table. I should have told him. I was a coward." I gripped his shoulders, feeling the new muscle he had built over months of hellish training. "You're a SEAL now, Caleb," I said firmly, looking him dead in the eye. "We don't do cowardice, not anymore. You stand up for the truth, even when it's inconvenient. Understood?" "Hoo-yah," he whispered automatically. "Go see Mom," I said, releasing him. He nodded and turned away. I stood there alone for a moment near the exit. I looked past the crowd, past the curious stares of the Millers and the other parents. I saw my father. He was standing by the double doors, silhouetted against the bright California sunlight streaming in from outside. He was alone. No one was shaking his hand. No one was asking him about his war stories. His shoulders were slumped, and his head hung low. He looked like a deflated balloon, empty and pathetic. The rage that had been burning in my gut since the car ride this morning finally cooled. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like tragedy. I took a deep breath, adjusted my glasses, and walked toward the door. The silence in the room was deafening, but the storm outside was just beginning. The walk to the truck was a gauntlet of suffocating silence. Dad marched ahead, head down, shoulders hunched, ignoring the curious looks from the lingering families in the parking lot. Mom scurried behind him, clutching her purse like a life preserver. I brought up the rear, still carrying the heavy cooler and the camera bag that now felt like evidence of a crime. We reached the Ford F-150. I threw the gear into the truck bed with a little more force than necessary, thud, and climbed into the driver's seat. The moment the heavy doors slammed shut, sealing us inside the cab, the air pressure seemed to drop. It was the calm before the detonation. Dad didn't even wait for me to put the key in the ignition. "You enjoyed that, didn't you?" His voice wasn't loud at first. It was a low, vibrating growl. He was staring straight ahead at the dashboard, his face a mottled patchwork of red and purple. "Excuse me?" I asked, my hand hovering over the gear shift. "You set me up!" he exploded. He slammed his open palm against the dashboard, making Mom flinch in the back seat. "You planned this whole thing. You let me run my mouth. You let me make a fool of myself in front of General Vance just so you could humiliate me." He turned to me then, his eyes bulging, veins throbbing in his neck. This was his defense mechanism. I knew it well. When Frank Riley felt small, he attacked. He couldn't process his own shame, so he had to convert it into anger and project it onto me. He had to believe I was a villain so he didn't have to admit he was a failure. "You wanted revenge because I wouldn't let you be in the picture," he shouted, spit flying. "You wanted to show off. Look at me, I'm the Admiral, and my dad is just a dumb ditch digger from Ohio." "Is that it, Amelia? Did you get your kick?" "Stop it, Frank." My mother's scream from the back seat was so sharp, so unexpected, that it actually silenced him for a second. In 40 years, I had never heard Mary Riley raise her voice above a whisper. "Just stop it," she sobbed. "No, Mom," I said, my voice terrifyingly calm. I turned in my seat to face him. "Let him speak. I want to hear this." I looked at my father. I didn't feel the old fear anymore. I felt cold. I felt like steel. "You think I have time for games, Dad?" I asked, my voice cutting through the heat in the cab. "I command the 7th Fleet. I manage nuclear assets. I don't have time to orchestrate a soap opera just to hurt your feelings." "Then why didn't you say anything?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Why did you let me treat you like a secretary?" "Because you never asked," I shot back. "Not once. In 20 years, Dad. You never asked me what I did. You asked if I was married. You asked if I had kids. You asked if I was gaining weight. But you never asked me about my service. You were too busy painting me as a failure so you could feel like the big man in the house." He scoffed, shaking his head, trying to regain his footing. "Service? What service? Sitting in an air-conditioned office, pushing papers? That's not sacrifice, Amelia. You don't know the first thing about sacrifice. You don't know what it's like to bleed for this country." That was it. The final line. I didn't yell. I didn't scream. I simply reached into the inside pocket of my blazer and pulled out my wallet. My fingers found the small laminated photograph I kept tucked behind my driver's license. It was old, the edges frayed. "Look at it," I said, tossing the photo onto his lap. He looked down, confused. It wasn't a graduation photo. It was grainy, taken in a field hospital tent. In the picture, I was lying on a stretcher, my face gray and covered in soot. My right shoulder was heavily bandaged, blood seeping through the gauze, staining my desert camouflage uniform dark red. Standing over me, pinning a medal onto my bloody uniform, was a younger General Vance. Dad stared at the photo. He squinted at the medal. It was a gold star surrounded by a silver wreath. "Do you know what that is?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer. His hand started to shake. As a military enthusiast, he knew exactly what it was. "That is the Silver Star, Dad," I said. "Third highest military decoration for valor in combat, awarded for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States." I didn't," he stammered. "Kandahar Province, November 2010, I recited, the mission report still burned into my memory. "My intelligence unit was ambushed during a site extraction. We were outnumbered 3-1. I took 2 rounds to the shoulder, but I returned fire. I neutralized 3 insurgents and dragged my comms officer 200 yards to the extraction point." I pointed at the photo in his lap. "I didn't get that for typing memos, Dad. I got that for killing men who were trying to kill us." Dad picked up the photo. His fingers brushed against the date printed in the corner. Nov. 26, 2010. He froze. His eyes widened as the date registered. "November 26th, he whispered. "Thanksgiving," I said ruthlessly. Do you remember that Thanksgiving, Dad? You called me. I was in the hospital in Germany, recovering from surgery. But I couldn't tell you that because the mission was classified. I told you I was swamped with work. And you screamed at me. You told me I was a selfish workaholic who didn't care about family. You told me I was ungrateful. I leaned closer to him. I was bleeding through my bandages while you were yelling at me about a turkey. The air went out of him. The anger, the bluster, the arrogance, it all evaporated, leaving behind a hollow shell. He looked at the photo, at the blood, at the metal, and then he looked at me. He really looked at me, seeing the faint scar on my neck that he had probably never noticed before. A silver star, he choked out. His face crumbled. The tears came instantly, overflowing his eyes and running down his weathered cheeks. It wasn't the polite crying of a funeral. It was the ugly, jagged sobbing of a man realizing that his entire worldview was a lie. He dropped the photo and slumped forward, burying his face in the steering wheel. His shoulders heaved violently. "Oh, God," he wept, his voice muffled against the leather. "Oh my God, Amelia, what have I done?" I sat back in my seat, watching him fall apart. The fire in my chest burned out, leaving only a dull, aching exhaustion. I didn't touch him. I didn't comfort him. Not yet. He needed to feel this. He needed to feel the full weight of the years he had stolen from us. "You didn't see me, Dad," I said softly, looking out the windshield at the ocean. "You never saw me." It was 11 o'clock at night. We found ourselves in the back corner of a Denny's just off the highway, the kind of place that serves as a sanctuary for weary travelers and broken families alike. The restaurant was mostly empty. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed with a low electric buzz, casting a sterile yellow glow over the red vinyl booths. The air smelled thick with the scent of cheap coffee, maple syrup, and industrial floor cleaner. A uniquely American perfume that somehow felt comforting in its familiarity. We had shed our armor. Caleb had changed out of his dress whites into a wrinkled gray t-shirt and jeans. I was back in my blazer, but I had loosened the scarf around my neck. Dad sat across from me, but he wasn't the boisterous, chest-thumping patriarch from the morning. He was just an old man in a flannel shirt. He held a white ceramic mug of black coffee between his hands, staring into the dark liquid as if it held the secrets of the universe. The steam rose up, curling around his face, highlighting the deep lines etched into his forehead. He looked 10 years older than he had at sunrise. The silence at the table wasn't the suffocating pressure of the truck ride. It was softer, heavier, colored by the exhaustion of a man who had finally put down a load he'd been carrying for decades. The waitress, a woman named Brenda with tired eyes and a kind smile, topped off Dad's coffee. He nodded a silent thanks, but didn't drink. "I never made it past Sergeant," he said suddenly. His voice was rough, like gravel grinding together. He didn't look up. He kept his eyes fixed on the coffee. "I was an E5, he continued, his thumb tracing the rim of the mug. "Average, forgettable. I came home, started the construction business, and told everyone I was a big shot. But I knew." He finally lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed and swollen. "When you got into the academy, and then when you started climbing, lieutenant, commander, captain, I got scared." I watched him, my own coffee forgotten. "Scared of what, Dad?" "Scared that you would look at me and see a failure," he whispered. The admission hung in the air between us, raw and terrifyingly honest. "I was your father. I was supposed to be the giant in the room. But you were becoming a giant, Amelia, and I felt myself shrinking." He took a shaky breath. "So I had to push you down. I had to convince myself and everyone else that you were just a paper pusher. If I could make your success look small, then maybe I could still feel big." It was jealousy, Amelia. Just petty, ugly jealousy from a scared old man. I looked at his hands. They were large, calloused, scarred from 40 years of hanging drywall and framing houses. They were the hands that had built the roof over my head. They were the hands that had held my bicycle seat when I was learning to ride. I reached across the sticky laminate table and covered his rough hand with mine. His skin felt like sandpaper, warm and familiar. "Dad," I said gently, waiting until he met my gaze. "Look at me." He blinked, a fresh tear leaking out. "I don't need you to be a war hero," I told him, my voice steady. "I don't need you to be a general. I work at the Pentagon, Dad. I have dozens of generals barking orders at me every single day. I have enough people trying to save the world." I squeezed his hand, feeling the tremors in his fingers. "I don't need another officer. I just need a dad. I need the guy who used to make me pancakes on Sundays. I need the guy who calls me just to ask if I've eaten dinner, not to ask if I've been promoted." Caleb, sitting next to Dad, looked down at his lap, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Dad looked at me, his chin trembling. He tried to speak, but the words got stuck in his throat. He just nodded, a jerky, desperate motion of understanding. A single tear rolled down his cheek and splashed onto the plastic tabletop. My mother, who had been silently observing this ceasefire, decided it was time to intervene. She smiled, a genuine relieved smile that took years off her face. She reached for the large platter that the waitress had placed in the center of the table. It wasn't a gourmet meal. It was a Grand Slam side order. A mountain of crinkle-cut French fries smothered in melted cheddar cheese and bacon bits. "Go on," Mom said, pushing the plate toward the center. "Eat. It's your favorite, Amelia. You used to beg for these after church." The smell of the melted cheese and salty bacon hit me, triggering a flood of childhood memories that had nothing to do with rank or disappointment. Dad sniffed, wiping his face with a paper napkin. He reached out and picked up a fry, heavy with cheese. His hand was shaking, but he extended it across the table toward me. "Eat, honey," he choked out. I'm sorry about the burnt burger. I'm sorry about the scraps." I looked at the fry. It was greasy, unhealthy, and absolutely perfect. I leaned forward and took it from his hand. I took a bite. It was warm and salty. "It's okay, Dad," I said, chewing slowly. "This is better than any steak." I picked up another fry and offered it to him. He took it, and for the first time in 20 years, we broke bread not as adversaries, but as father and daughter. The taste of the cheap cheese and the diner grease mixed with the salt of our tears. It wasn't just food. It was the taste of forgiveness. The curbside drop-off at Terminal 2 of San Diego International Airport is usually a place of chaotic, hurried goodbyes. Cars double park, horns honk, and people rush to drag luggage out of trunks before the airport police wave them along. But as I put the truck in park and stepped out into the mild morning air, everything felt slow, deliberate. My parents were standing on the sidewalk with their luggage. Mom looked tired but peaceful, clutching a bag of souvenirs for the grandkids back in Ohio. Caleb gave me a quick, bone-crushing hug, whispered a final, "Thank you, sis," and grabbed the bags to head toward the check-in counter. That left me and Dad. He wasn't wearing the tight, uncomfortable suit he had worn to the ceremony yesterday. He wasn't wearing his construction flannel either. He was wearing a brand new navy blue t-shirt. The cotton was crisp, the fold lines still visible. He must have snuck into the Navy Exchange store on base while I was grabbing coffee this morning. He stood with his chest puffed out, but not in the arrogant way he used to. He stood so the white lettering on the left breast pocket was clearly visible to everyone walking past. Proud dad of a Navy Rear Admiral. He didn't say a word about it. He didn't point to it. He just wore it, quietly broadcasting the truth he had tried to bury for 20 years. It was his way of apologizing, a silent billboard of atonement worn right over his heart. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, looking at the sliding glass doors of the terminal. "I guess this is it." "I guess so," I said. "Flight leaves in 2 hours. Don't miss it." Usually this would be the part where he gave me a half-hearted, one-armed hug and told me to keep out of trouble or find a husband. But Frank Riley didn't move toward me. Instead, he took a step back. He looked down at his feet and shuffled them until his heels were touching. He straightened his spine, pulling his shoulders back, erasing the slump of old age. The crowd of travelers flowed around us, businessmen in suits, families going to Disney, backpackers. They were all in a hurry. But my father stood still, an island of discipline in a river of chaos. Slowly, with a hand that trembled slightly from age but moved with the muscle memory of a young man, he raised his right hand to his brow. He didn't look at me as his daughter. He looked at me as his superior officer. "Goodbye, Admiral," he said. His voice cracked on the title, thick with a mixture of regret and immense, overwhelming respect. I felt a lump form in my throat, hard and painful. I straightened my own posture, mirroring his stance. I wasn't wearing my uniform. I was in jeans and a blazer. But in that moment, we were both soldiers. I smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached my eyes. I raised my hand and returned the salute, sharp and precise. "Goodbye, Dad," I said softly. "Stay safe, Sergeant." His eyes widened slightly at the rank. I saw his chin wobble. For a man who felt he had failed because he never rose high enough, hearing his rank spoken with honor by a flag officer was the ultimate validation. He held the salute for a second longer, then nodded, turned sharply on his heel, and walked into the terminal without looking back. He couldn't look back. I knew he was crying again, and Frank Riley still had enough pride left to want to hide that from his commanding officer. I got back into the truck and merged onto the I-5, heading north toward the secure facility where I worked. The silence in the cab was different now. It wasn't empty, it was peaceful. 10 minutes into the drive, my phone buzzed on the center console. It was a secure line from the Pentagon. I tapped the hands-free button. "Riley." "Admiral, we have a situation developing in the South China Sea," a clipped voice said. "Satellite recon shows movement near the Spratly Islands. The chairman needs a briefing in 30 minutes. "I'm 10 minutes out," I replied, my voice shifting instantly into command mode. "Have the tactical assessment ready on my desk." "Aye, ma'am." The line clicked dead. Just like that, the family drama was over. The real world, the dangerous, complex world of geopolitics and naval strategy, was waiting for me. I would walk into a windowless room, surrender my phone, and spend the next 12 hours making decisions that would never make the evening news, but would keep the world spinning. Mr. Miller back in Ohio would probably still tell people I was a secretary. The neighbors would still wonder why Frank's daughter never came home for holidays. And as I looked at the road ahead, I realized something profound. I didn't care. I glanced at the dashboard. My military ID card was sitting there, catching the morning sun. It wasn't a heavy secret anymore. It was just plastic and a microchip. General MacArthur once said, "Old soldiers never die. They just fade away." But as I accelerated down the highway, I thought about a different kind of strength. For years, I thought strength was proving people wrong. I thought it was the roar of the jets or the snap of a salute. But I was wrong. Real strength isn't noise. Real strength is the ability to endure being misunderstood to protect the people you love, even when they are the ones misunderstanding you. It is the patience to wait until they are ready to see the truth. My father finally saw it. He finally understood. And that, more than the stars on my shoulder or the medals in my drawer, was the greatest victory of my career. We live in a world that is obsessed with noise. Everyone wants the credit, the applause, and the spotlight immediately. But my journey with my father taught me a different truth. Real value is quiet. Just because someone, even a parent, doesn't see your worth, it doesn't mean you are worthless. It just means they are looking through the wrong lens. If you are making sacrifices in the dark, if you are carrying a heavy load with no applause, please remember this. The truth doesn't need to scream to be heard. It just needs time. Stand your ground. Your salute is coming. Now, I want to turn the conversation over to you. I know many of you listening have walked in my shoes. You've been the invisible one at the family table, swallowing your pride just to keep the peace. Or maybe you represent the quiet strength in your own circle. I want to read your story. Tell me about your Emilia moment in the comments below. And if this story resonated with your heart, please do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let's build a community where every silent hero finally gets heard. Until next time.